In 1820, when Governor Macquarie was still in power, the colony of New South Wales covered the entire continent of Australia. As more and more Europeans arrived, this original colony was subdivided 5 times. First when Tasmania was established as a separate colony, then Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, and finally Queensland, leaving the colony of New South Wales with the territory the state holds today. Some of these colonies, such as South Australia, were founded as places for free settlers. Others, like Queensland, were established as remote prisons, while others, such as the colony of Victoria, were founded almost by accident.
European interest in Victoria began soon after the settlement of Sydney, but there were many false starts in actually establishing a settlement in the south. That changed in 1835, when a 34-year-old adventurer named John Batman, along with 10 others, came across from Tasmania and explored inland from Port Phillip Bay. Just a few kilometres to the north from here, Batman completed the most outrageous deal in Australia's history when he purchased from some local Aborigines 245,000 acres of choice land for a supply of blankets, tomahawks, flour, and a small annual rent. The New South Wales government had no knowledge of this deal, and the local Aborigines wouldn't have known what they were doing. But Batman, with the elders' marks on a bill of sale, considered he owned this whole region. Shortly afterwards, some members from Batman's party rode up the Yarra River, and they came to a rocky outcrop which stopped them from going any further. At that point, they decided to establish a settlement. The rocky outcrop has since been removed, but it would have run across the river here, and the settlement has grown to be the city of Melbourne.
Although Batman's agreement with the Aborigines was totally unfair, his purchase did establish the first permanent settlement in Victoria, and Melbourne soon became a busy and productive town. The New South Wales government, however, was alarmed at its lack of involvement, and it declared the agreement to be illegal, and it took over control of the settlement and the surrounding region. Europeans soon realised that the climate and land in Victoria favoured a wool industry, and for those who were quick enough to venture into the interior, there were many choices of prime grazing land, with sometimes just a flip of a coin to decide who would take what. After they had dispossessed the local Aboriginal tribe of their land, some of the settlers, or squatters as they were called, became very wealthy. This laid the foundations for what would come to be known as the squattocracy, a group of powerful squatter families that would influence government in Victoria for years to come. As Victoria developed from its adventurous beginnings, it became impossible to administer everything from Sydney, and in 1851 Victoria was separated from New South Wales by a British Act of Parliament. In doing so, Victoria became the 5th colony created on the Australian continent, and although this seemed practical at the time due to Victoria's distance from Sydney, it was another major step in the subdivision of Australia into a complicated patchwork of independent colonies.
Just a couple of weeks later, news came in of rich gold discoveries at Ballarat and Bendigo in central Victoria. Over the next 10 years, the colony would produce a third of the world's gold, some 20 million ounces, a fabulous fortune that ushered in Victoria's golden age. As these riches poured in, the quiet, pastoral colony of Victoria was to change dramatically.
Almost overnight, Melbourne lost half its male population. Police and government officials at every level quit to take part in the diggings. And as news spread around the world, the first wave of overseas immigrants started to arrive. These people from Europe, America and Asia had heard that men on the diggings could make the colossal fortune of £1,800 in a single day. And with bleak prospects in their own country, they wanted to be part of it. In the towns that sprang up with each discovery of gold, local Australians mixed with these new arrivals who'd brought with them the desire to begin life afresh, free of the intolerance and class systems of Europe. This sentiment was nurtured on the goldfields as people saw that luck and hard, back-breaking work were more important than your family's good name, and that the poorest person one day could be the richest tomorrow. As a result, this mix of people on the goldfields of Victoria developed a strong sense of equality and a feeling of pride as they realised that they were as important as any in earning the colony's wealth.
At first, when the going was good in the early 1850s, there was little time to worry about the finer points of equality and democracy, as everyone scrambled to pan as much gold as they could from the countryside. Here at Ballarat in central Victoria, a tent city of miners and their families stretched across the plains, each tent fighting for position between piles of discarded gravels and open mine shafts. Even the richest deposits, however, only last so long, and by 1854 the miners here were finding things tough going, as most of the surface gold was gone and they were having to dig deeper and deeper shafts to find decent gold. As the miners' anger grew, it began to focus on one thing: the monthly digging licence of 30 shillings that had to be paid to the government, regardless of whether your claim produced gold or not. This was seen as a direct example of the government not having the miners' interests at heart, and people here began to call for political reforms. At first, their demand was for the digging licence to be abolished, but as democratic feelings swelled, they soon began to demand the right to vote for their own representatives in Victoria's Parliament.
By November 1854, these tensions bubbled to the surface in Ballarat. After what the miners felt was the false arrest and imprisonment of 3 men, a public meeting was called and 10,000 people signed up to form the Ballarat Reform League. An Irishman, Peter Lalor, was declared to be the leader of the league, and with defiance running strong, the miners burnt their hated licences in a large bonfire. As people from all around the globe watched the flames die down, they were determined that the government should listen to their demand that they be represented in Victoria's Parliament. The government, however, would not compromise. And the very next day, the police mounted a provocative licence hunt, even firing their guns as they searched for those who had burnt their licences the night before.
With miners' anger at boiling point, their leader, Peter Lalor, instructed his men to build a stockade that would have been somewhere around here, although its exact location cannot be found with any certainty. We call it the Eureka Stockade, a name that came from the Eureka seam of gold that ran nearby. This stockade was not a piece of military architecture designed for serious fighting, but rather it was a symbolic enclosure behind which the miners felt they had some control. Cannons such as we see here today were certainly not here in 1854. Even so, emotions were running strong, and the miners here felt they were freedom fighters, even swearing to fight to the death as they knelt in front of the Southern Cross, a flag that the women of the digs had stitched together.
To the wealthy members of Victoria's government, this looked like an armed uprising, led by the Irish, the poor and foreigners. Fearing that a mass meeting planned for Sunday the 3rd of December would bring more trouble, the government acted first, and at daybreak 350 troops from 2 military regiments attacked the 120 miners who'd been manning the stockade overnight. The crude fortifications were quickly overrun, but then the military overstepped their mark, and for the next hour, not just in the stockade, but for a kilometre in all directions, the killing went on, even to the point of miners pleading for their lives with gold before being bayoneted by the troops.
Official reports on the Eureka stockade had the death toll at 35 miners and 6 troopers, although another 20 miners later died of their wounds. The miners' leader, Peter Lalor, managed to escape the stockade after being shot in his left arm that later had to be amputated, and he went into hiding. The storming of the Eureka stockade caused a wave of public anger across the colony of Victoria, as this was seen as an instance of an upper-class government who were unrepresentative of the people, grossly abusing its power. As public opinion swung behind the miners, momentum also built to grant the miners their major demand, a democratic Victorian parliament elected by all the male citizens.
The next year, in February 1855, the 13 men who'd been arrested for treason on the day of the battle stood trial in Melbourne. When the first defendant, the African-American John Josephs, was found not guilty by the jury, cheers were heard around the streets of Melbourne. The government promptly dropped the charges on the other 12 and announced major changes to the mining licence. Peter Lalor then emerged from hiding, and in November 1855 he was elected to the Victorian Parliament as the Goldfields representative. It was not until the next year, in 1856, however, that the major aim of the miners at Ballarat was achieved, when Victoria's Parliament became fully elected and voting rights were given to all male citizens. Since New South Wales had just enacted similar reforms, these changes in Victoria now allowed the majority of Australians to live under democratic and representative parliaments.
At the Eureka stockade were a mix of nationalities, from Irish to black Americans. But there were one large group of people on the goldfields who were not represented at all, the Chinese. And while it is clear that the miners at Ballarat had lofty ideals, these ideals did not extend to all races of men.
Chinese immigration to Australia had begun before the discovery of gold, but like every other nationality, their population increased rapidly in the 1850s as news of the gold rush spread. The Chinese who arrived here were mostly poor farmers from the southern provinces of China who had little or no English. As could be expected, the Chinese sought the security of each other, and they tended to group together when working on the goldfields. This angered the European miners, who felt the Chinese were being exclusive, and since the Chinese worked together in large groups, it appeared that they were taking more than their fair share of the gold. Tensions between Europeans and Chinese came to the surface at several of the goldfields, but the most violent expression came at Lambing Flat, now known as the town of Young in New South Wales. In 1860, when the first gold in the district was discovered, news of the find travelled fast, and within months there were 30,000 miners at the diggings, all frantically searching for their share of the riches. The wealth, however, did not last forever, and in the case of Lambing Flat it ran out quicker than usual, and within a year of the first discovery it was getting tough to earn a living. Looking for someone to blame for their situation, the miners turned to an easy target, the 1,000 Chinese miners who were also working the deposits. When the New South Wales government refused to ban the Chinese from the diggings, the miners' anger became violent, and in June 1861 several thousand Europeans attacked the Chinese camp. In the riot, the miners burnt tents and possessions, assaulted the Chinese, and took great delight in cutting off as many pigtails as they could. Miraculously, no one was killed, but over 500 Chinese were injured and their camp was destroyed.
In late 1861, as a result of the riots here, the New South Wales government passed a law that limited Chinese immigration into the colony. This began a chain reaction, and within 20 years all colonies had passed similar legislation that actively discriminated against the Chinese in particular and Asians in general. This legislation reminds us that when we talk about democracy in the colonies, we need to bear in mind that there were many people in colonial society, such as Asians, women and Aborigines, who did not take part in the political process, and they therefore failed to benefit directly from the growth of democracy in the colonies of Australia.
By the 1870s, most of the easily reached alluvial gold had disappeared from the creeks and gullies of southeastern Australia. Now thousands of miners had to find something else to do, and because Australia at this time was still largely agricultural, with very little industry to provide employment, most miners wanted to turn to farming as a way of supporting their families. But this was easier said than done. Since the 1840s, most of the agricultural land had been occupied by squatters, some of whom controlled huge leases of land, and for miners disillusioned with the goldfields, there was simply no good land left. To free up land, the colonial governments divided up some of the largest squatting leases and sold the land cheaply in small parcels to families who were prepared to farm their block. Life for these selectors, as they were known, was not easy, as they often had to face the hostility of the local squatter who'd lost land under this policy. If the squatter could not use his wealth to bankrupt the selectors, they often used their political power, with the help of the police, to make life for the selector as difficult as possible. One family who took up Selection 57A on the banks of 11 Mile Creek, just outside Greta in northern Victoria, shows the helplessness that many selectors felt when faced with such a system. There were 9 members in this family, a recent widow, Ellen Kelly, and her 8 children. As his father was dead, the responsibility for the family came to rest with the eldest son, a 14-year-old boy named Ned Kelly. And the subsequent story of the Kelly struggle for justice has become an Australian legend that's been painted, acted and sung about ever since. Here was the colourful tale of a native-born man who refused to submit to a government that he regarded as being too authoritarian and unfair.
Surrounded them and told them to come out. The outlaws answered with their guns and wounded Trooper Hare. Kelly cried, "Come in now and take us if you dare." The troopers said, "We're not enough, our efforts will be vain." They sent for reinforcements and they came up by train.
Ned Kelly and his family moved to Greta in 1868 when they took up this small and not very productive selection. Their house would have been somewhere around here, although only a photograph survives of the original slab hut, and the ruins that we see here today date to a later house that was built on the same site. The Kelly brothers, principally Ned and Dan, were well known to the police of the district after they had stolen some horses and cattle from the local squatter. And while Ned certainly hung out with more serious criminals, such as the bushranger Harry Power, it does not seem that he wanted to follow Power's life of crime. Things in the house here took a nasty turn on the 15th of April 1878, when a police constable, Alexander Fitzpatrick, who was visiting here on other matters, received a slight wound to the wrist after he'd attempted to pull the Kellys' sister Kate onto his lap to kiss her. Although the wound was minor and probably self-inflicted in the ruckus that followed, the Kellys knew that the law would not listen to their side of the story, and so they packed their swags and headed south to the Wombat Ranges to wait for things to die down. The next day, instead of pursuing Ned and Dan, the police returned here, and in a gross miscarriage of justice, they arrested Ellen Kelly, the boy's mother, who was eventually sentenced to 3 years hard labour just for being present when a police officer was assaulted. By this act, the Kellys clearly saw that the Victorian justice system was not there to protect selectors such as themselves, and that the police force, which did have some arrogant and undisciplined members within it, was being used by the powerful squatters in Victoria's Parliament to deny people like the Kellys the basic rights they should have been free to enjoy.
At their hideout in the Wombat Ranges, 50 kilometres to the south of Greta, the Kellys were joined by two friends, Joe Byrne and Steve Hart. The young men used their time to look for gold along the creeks in the area in an effort to raise money to secure the release of Ellen Kelly and to give support to their family. Incredibly, some of the potholes that may have been dug by the Kelly gang as they searched for gold can still be seen in the area.
The Kellys, along with Steve Hart and Joe Byrne, remained secluded in this bush for 6 months, although friends told them that the police were still hunting for them and telling anyone who cared to listen that the Kellys would be shot like dogs if they were found. Even here, however, the Kellys were not safe, and on the 26th of October 1878, the Kelly gang rose to national prominence after an incident called the Battle of Stringy Bark Creek that takes its name from the stream just behind me here. On that day, the Kellys had come across a police camp that would have been somewhere around here. This was dangerously close to where the Kellys had their hut, and as the Kellys did not have any good rifles and believed that they would be shot on sight, they decided to bail up the 4 police here and take their weapons from them. In the nervousness of the attack, disaster struck, and 3 of the police here were killed. Tragically, one of them, Sergeant Kennedy, who had been mortally wounded after a brave gunfight through the bush here, had to be killed by Ned with a mercy shot to the head. This act earned Ned the hatred of the Victorian police, who felt he had murdered Kennedy out of cold blood, whereas in truth, Ned had not wanted to leave Kennedy, a man he admired, to die alone in the bush.
The 3 murdered policemen were buried at state expense in the cemetery of Mansfield near the Wombat Ranges. And as these men were laid to rest, the Kelly gang stopped being just petty criminals and became outlaws. Ned realised the seriousness of his actions, and he wrote a long letter to a member of the Victorian Parliament outlining his version of events. With this letter, Ned hoped people would understand that his gang was only acting in self-defence against the obvious police and government harassment of his family. In Melbourne, however, the letter was largely ignored, and the reward for the capture of the Kelly gang was increased. This forced the gang to remain on the run for another 1.5 years, during which time they carried out some daring robberies and gained notoriety across Victoria and New South Wales. But the noose was tightening, more and more police were assigned to hunt them down, and Aboriginal trackers were brought from Queensland to help with the search. On the 28th of June 1880, Ned Kelly decided it was time to bring things to a conclusion. In a rash and outrageous plan, he decided to halt a police train at the small settlement of Glenrowan and take the police on board hostage, to be released when the sentence against his mother Ellen Kelly was dropped. But, like the battle at Stringybark Creek, this plan also went terribly wrong.
In a scene that is etched into Australia's consciousness, the Kelly gang, along with some civilian hostages, took refuge in Anne Jones's hotel that was near Glenrowan Station as they waited for the police train to come up from Benalla. To stop the train, the Kelly gang had pulled up the rails a couple of 100 metres from here, but the police train was warned by a local school teacher and it was able to stop here at the station, where the police got off and went across to the hotel, firing as they went. Wearing armour made out of ploughs, the Kelly gang held the police off, but not forever. In the hotel that would have stood right here, Dan Kelly, Steve Hart and Joe Byrne were killed, probably from gunshot wounds, rather than the fire that the police used to burn this hotel to the ground. Ned Kelly could have got away from the siege here, as he had slipped away under the cover of darkness to warn his friends that his plan had failed. However, in an action that makes sure that Ned Kelly's name lives on, he attempted to return to the hotel here to help his brother and mates.
Against the steel, but Ned, he did not fall. He cried, "Come on and do your worst, I'll fight you one and all." Then Sergeant Steele ran up and fired at Ned and brought him down. He tried to keep on fighting as he lay upon the ground.
As Ned Kelly attempted to make his way back to Anne Jones's hotel, which is just a couple of 100 metres away through here, he was shot in his unprotected legs and brought down at this spot. The first police on the scene here wanted to kill Kelly immediately as payback for Stringybark Creek, but calmer heads prevailed and he was taken alive. When Kelly was stripped of his armour, his injuries consisted of many wounds, 6 of which were major, along with the dents of 18 bullets in the armour itself.
Taken to Melbourne and placed in a building we now call the Old Melbourne Jail, Ned Kelly was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to death. Judge Barry, who passed the death sentence on Ned, was the same judge who had sentenced his mother, Ellen Kelly, to hard labour, and so he had taken part in both the beginning and the end of the Kelly saga. The final chapter came on November the 11th, 1880, when 28-year-old Ned Kelly was taken from his cell and hanged. According to what is now legend, his last words were, "Such is life." The authorities had finally crushed the spirit of this wild but brilliant man.
To understand why Ned Kelly is so important to Australians, this chart here tells us a lot. It's a list of all of those people who were hanged in the jail, beginning in 1842 and going right through to 1924. What I find incredible is that even by 1880, when Ned Kelly was hung, he was only the second Australian-born, non-Aboriginal person hanged in this jail. He was truly one of Australia's own. And when you look at the mask that was taken from Kelly's face soon after he died, you can't help but wonder what he might have achieved if he had been born on the other side of the tracks. In the many letters that Ned Kelly wrote to the authorities to try to explain his actions, there is a hint of a political agenda, and some historians believe that he was trying to establish a republic in northern Victoria. But mostly these letters are a cry for help, the cry of the dispossessed against a system that showed them no mercy. In time, the story of Ned Kelly illustrated what could happen if you denied justice to a particular group of people, and it showed, in a very dramatic way, that the laws and institutions of our country are there for everyone, not just the privileged few.
The hanging of Ned Kelly in 1880 was a turning point for the colonies of Australia. Gone were the convict days, and gone too were the reckless days of the gold rushes and bushrangers. But the struggles of the past were not forgotten, and lessons learned from events such as the Eureka Stockade and the siege at Glenrowan shaped the way people in the colonies viewed their world. And as these colonies moved towards federation over the next 20 years, this history of rebellion showed that Australians would literally fight to enjoy democratic institutions and fair justice in a court of law. With these foundations in place, the task ahead was to reverse the subdivision of the continent into separate colonies and instead unite them to form a new nation.